Hello, everyone, and welcome to Professor Flowers. Sorry, I was supposed to ping you when that lame intro was done. Let me just see if I'm audible quickly. Looks like we are. Brilliant. So welcome. Again, I'm joined by Professor Flowers, who is on that side, apparently. And she needs no introduction at this point, obviously. But if you would just like to tell us very quickly about who you are and what you do and what you're about, that'd be fantastic.
Sure. My name's Lua. My pronouns are she, her, or he, him. I have a YouTube channel on YouTube called Professor Flowers.
And it's very good, actually. I've been perusing some of the things you go over there. The Real Talk one on how the left can't talk about race in particular, I recommend. It's actually very good. Before we get into it, I just wanted to get something out of the way quickly because you've gotten into some hot water over what appears to me, at least, to be a failure of communication, and it's been extremely frustrating to see. We went a little bit over that on last night's stream that unfortunately died midway through because YouTube hates me, apparently. Hopefully that won't happen here. But we've talked already briefly before, and from everything I've seen, you're the farthest thing from a bad faith or a malicious actor. So it's been really, I've been a bit dismayed to see how you've been treated in that regard. So obviously, we were prompted to have this conversation initially because of your conversation with Vosh. And having perused your content over the past few days, I've come to the conclusion that your portrayal in that debate just doesn't represent your actual positions at all. And that when you scrutinize what happened a bit more closely, your positions in that debate, frankly, even from a general milquetoast liberal standpoint, actually read as quite benign, and I don't think they warranted at all the hostile reception that you got. So with your permission, I just wanted to quickly run through two major points that I took away from your debate with Vosh, run them by you and see if I'm reading it correctly. Does that work for you?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so first, when I watched the debate, I noticed that there was some waffling going on between two very different arguments, not by you specifically, within the context, like the whole debate itself. The first being whether bigotry is condemnable in the same way when held by a black person against white people, as it is when a white nationalist holds a similar bigotry in form against black people. That on the one side, and then the other question of whether bigotry is ever good in and of itself. So what I saw was Vosh was grilling you as if you were arguing the affirmative and valorizing bigotry by black people, where I took you to be saying that, unlike in the case of white nationalist hatred against non-whites, groups that have experienced actual and ongoing oppression actually do deserve understanding, which isn't saying that their prejudice is a good thing, only that it's not their fault. Does that fairly represent your position, or how would you modify that?
I think that's generally true. As far as Black people being bigoted, there are Black people. I think it's like a little bit also more complicated because there are Black people who are bigoted in these very extreme ways. Like I talk about how there's like Black separatists who are Black supremacists. They're anti-Semitic. There's like a number of issues that they have, and I think we need to be very critical of that still. But I think it also is understanding in the context of looking at these movements where they're trying to, like Black supremacy, for example. Obviously, that's not true. There's not like a superior race. We're all one race and so on. But understanding why are people responding to that in the face of white supremacy doesn't make it okay, but it changes the context of how we're analyzing it, as opposed to white supremacists who kind of just have this like presumption of being superior based on these like long years of colonialism. I think I'm more of saying like the context doesn't make these things okay, but should inform how we address these issues. So there's that aspect of it. But then I think there's also this issue where in the debate, Bosch talks about reverse racism. And I talk about it in my video, and I know that it came up in the debate a little bit as well. But my point isn't necessarily, I think there's a misunderstanding where when Black people often make jokes about white people, that this is like the same that this is bigotry. And I think oftentimes, obviously, there's exceptions, but oftentimes when people are making jokes about white people, the joke is about racism at the end of the day, or how white people are unaware that their white identities are in fact racialized and what that means and the consequences of that. The core of those jokes often, but not always, come down to that. So I don't actually necessarily find it to be bigotry. I think it's making humor about racism 9 out of 10 times. And obviously there's going to be some sort of exception of some sort of like actual atrocity. But I think I really wanted to ask white people to understand that where these jokes are coming from, as opposed to when people make fun of Black people, it's often coming from years of racism, coming from the justification of dehumanizing people so you could enslave them for profit. And that's like that's what's behind the joke, is like years and years of racism, like people making fun of like, you know, us, our culture, people making fun of how we look. That's rooted in hundreds of years of racism. So I wanted to point out that difference.
Yeah, fair enough. So it's a modification in how you interpret what's going on. You're not recharacterizing a bad thing as a good thing, just for clarification.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, fair enough. And then the second point, and this is somewhat related to the first, this is the one that really got you. You got really pigeonholed into questions of ethnic cleansing. So in connection with what we just talked about, I took you again to mean that in the context of oppressed groups wanting an ethno-state versus oppressor groups wanting an ethno-state, the former again deserve a level of charity and empathy that the latter don't. And that strikes me at least as perfectly reasonable. When a Black nationalist wants a Black-only space, it's typically argued on grounds, at least judging from my own limited experience, on maintaining sort of identity and safety in a modern context that's, I guess, saturated with institutional and cultural bias, if not often outright hostility to them. But when you see white nationalists make the case for an ethno-state, like they'll half-heartedly pretend like it's for the mutual protection of different ethnic groups or whatever. But when it comes right down to it, they view those groups with contempt and regard them as inferior. So you, again, near the end of that debate, very clearly state that you're not in favor of an ethno-state. And furthermore, you explicitly say that just because a group is engaging in decolonization doesn't mean that they can just do anything. And I took you to mean genocide in that context. There were some practical ambiguities insofar as you say that you think an ethnically homogenous community can be achieved without genocidal action taking place in the context of an already majorly Black majority community. And of course, like you can, that's a separate argument that you can have. But my read on you during that debate was that you were essentially against genocide and state-enforced ethnic homogeneity. I think you even say something to the effect of you're against state-enforced racial homogeneity in marriages and things like that. You were primarily concerned, I read you as in that conversation, with understanding and the different kinds of warrant for treating Black nationalists versus white nationalists with a different kind of understanding. Is that a fair representation of your stance there?
Yeah. Is it okay if I expand on that a little bit?
Please, by all means.
Yeah. I first off, like, it's just really weird because I'm not a separatist, like, at all.
No, when you say as much in the debate, yeah.
Yeah. It's just like the reason why I brought all of this up is because people don't understand what separatism is. So Vosh was saying like, oh, I wasn't trying to attack Black nationalism. I meant to attack Black separatism. And so in the video that I made that sparked this debate, I was saying, listen, there are definitely ways you can practice separatism that are really messed up, in my opinion. And my point is, though, that's not all of what separatism is. Like, you can practice separatism by simply like focusing on Black people having their own governance. Like, that would still be Black separatism. And so my point is like, there's really messed up ways that this can happen, and there are not messed up ways that can happen. And so I wanted to encourage people to listen. If someone's saying that they are Black separatists, I wanted to encourage people to listen to what they're saying. Are they saying that they want a state-enforced ethno-state? If they are, then that's probably something that's pretty messed up. Or are they just, or if someone's saying they're Black separatists, are they just talking about Black people being able to have their own governance? Because that in itself is not something that's bad. And so all I was trying to say in that video was to hear what people are saying. And just because you hear Black separatists, don't automatically assume that it's something that's necessarily bad, because separatism in itself isn't necessarily hateful. And then in the debate, Vosh starts talking about like, well, ethno-states and da-da-da-da. And I didn't bring this up in the debate, but I've heard of people who are isolationist. And there's people who, there's Indigenous people who are isolationists, and they kind of like live in their own pockets of society and people don't interact with them. And they are truly this kind of ethno state that I don't really think is bad. Um, there's one thing that I want to mention from this. If Black people, like, let's say, like, hypothetically, if there are like if there was a country that only had Black Africans, it wouldn't be an ethno state because there's Africa's the most diverse continent in the world. So I don't say that. I say that mostly to just like say that we're talking about Africa in a way that's just not accurate. But like, let's say that there was like a place, a small community of people of Black people who are Black separatists, and we're like, we don't want to engage with the world. We want to have our own little like space of Black people. I don't necessarily think that would be bad, but I also think that that's a very hypothetical situation because most Black separatists aren't looking to do something like that. Like, even talking about it feels a little bit ridiculous because when you look at the way we don't have to look at that weird hypothetical, we can look at ways that people actually have practiced Black separatism. So I hope that kind of clarifies that question.
Yeah, a little bit. So you distinguish between an ethno state and Black governance. How do you distinguish those? Like, what's packed into that difference in your?
Well, I don't really think there is that. The reason why I'm making this distinguish is not to is mostly to point out that the way that we talk about Africa is just very grossly reductive. Because Africa is the most genetically diverse continent in the world. There's over 2,000 languages. It just wouldn't be an ethno-state has to be made of like one ethnicity. So this is something that's more of a semantic thing that I'm pointing out. But the reason why I'm pointing it out is because I think it's very messed up how people don't understand the rich different cultures that are just even in one area of Africa, how it's not, an ethnicity of Black people. There's many different ethnicities. And so that's why I pointed out. I think at the end of the day, it doesn't really change like the issue of like, well, there are Black people who want to have like their own like Black governance and their own like, specifically like Black spaces. So the semantics is more pointing out that the way that we're talking about Africa is just inaccurate, more so than it changing the hypothetical scenario too much.
Okay, and just for clarification again, just to really like get this concretized, when we're talking about distinguishing Black separatism from, again, like what people infer as being the sort of technical consequences of that as a policy and practice, you specify that this is largely hypothetical. I think how I'm reading you here is you're saying that technically we can imagine ways in which that can take place without these bad things happening. That doesn't necessarily mean that in any of the major examples that somebody might bring up, like, well, what do you do in the case of I don't know, like the Dutch or whatever, that there are cases where it's actually physically impossible to do without these things. I think that's really where you got hammered. I think what you're saying rather is that the bare desire to construct a community or a space within a community that is sort of exclusionary on grounds that roughly track colonial domination. There's nothing inherently murderous about that, effectively, is what your position is.
Yeah, and then there's also places like Tulsa or Rosewood, and they weren't like explicitly separatist, but it happened during segregation, so they were separate by force, but they were just people trying to find their own governance and autonomy, and they got bombed. And so there's all these different ways that separatism could play out. That's not a dystopian ethno state, and that's really only as far as I wanted to say, because I'm not
fair enough.
Yeah, because I'm not I don't want to like. Another thing is that I wasn't, I know you and I have talked about this, but I was not planning on debating these topics. I don't want to debate. I think it's actually really disgusting, like debating colonialism, for example, because these things aren't hypothetical. These things are things that need to be listened to and not argued. And then with separatism, again, I don't want to represent separatists if I'm not. I just want to ask white people to try to have a little bit more understanding before developing an opinion. And that truly is all that I wanted to say.
Yeah.
And it ended up being a debate with Vosh and I, where now thousands of people think I'm a genocidal Black separatist. So that's
No.
great.
Oh, well, again, like a major part about being able to talk about these issues is being able to entertain these positions and to take them seriously without necessarily onboarding them. Like you can take an entirely sympathetic view to the most extreme black nationalists and still like know that in practice you're going to end up fighting against them if they try to put whatever they want to be the case into effect. But I mean, you like these aren't contradictory things. In fact, you kind of need to be able to at least to a rudimentary degree, understand where people are coming from in order to engage with them in a productive way, even if that means like in an antagonistic way. So that was a bit frustrating to see. I did notice in that debate it was kind of interesting. So when we're talking about decolonization and the limits put upon it, now I'm as you are, I'm opposed to genocidal action in principle and even anti-democratic action in principle. What was kind of strange to me is that I think Vosh actually said, and I'm roughly paraphrasing, you have to leave the democratic institutions intact and things like that. And that struck me as very strange for a number of reasons, regardless of the fact that it sort of it runs adjacent to my values. Um, the institutions that he is referring to and the rights and what have you, these are themselves going to be colonial impositions. These aren't things that emerged from the culture of the colonized places themselves. These are things that were instantiated by European plants, effectively. And so it leaves you with a very strange sort of it leaves you in a very strange bind where, yeah, we're all for anti-colonial action. Just don't touch any of the colonial institutions that this action is directed against. And it ends up being very cruel because you're forced into a situation where it's like uh, you can't engage in anti-colonial action for the sake of the autonomy of an oppressed people, because now the terms of good and evil are entirely in colonial terms. And like that's how this immediately gets slanted towards, well, you want to dismantle these institutions, well, therefore you are genocidal, because like what else is there? We've defined this as the spectrum. There are the democratic institutions that we've put in conveniently, and then there are their opposite, which is of course Hitler. So like what do you do? And I think that's that seemed to me to be at the center of the failure for you and Vosh to communicate, which was frustrating because near the end of the conversation, I think you guys were actually almost seeing eye to eye a little bit, and then he brought it right back to the genocide thing. What do you think of that? Like, what, in your opinion, like what was the thing on which the failure to communicate effectively with people like this? What does that pivot on?
Well,
If
I
that
mean, I
made
think
any sense.
it made a lot of sense. I think you kind of hit the position that I was in, where it's like you can't really deconstruct colonial institutions, so now you have to like be anti-colonialist on colonial terms, and that in itself being an issue. Honestly, though, I think the issue in communicating, and this might seem like a little bit of a tangent, but honestly, like this is really what I think happened. I think that I made 2 videos saying that Vosh's rhetoric makes leftist spaces more hostile to any Black leftists who disagree with him. I think that really annoyed him. And then he asked me to debate. And then when I tried to bring that up, he went, "No, I'm not unreasonable for comparing these Black leftists to Nazis. And in fact, you're basically a Nazi." I think that's actually pretty much what our conversation was in a nutshell. I think it could have been about anything.
Mhm.
And I think he just wanted to be like, I'm justified in comparing you all to Nazis. And it didn't even have to be about colonialism. It could have been about, or separatism. It could have been about a number of things that I've been talking about. I think that's actually what happened. I don't think there was, and I also didn't come into that debate thinking that we were going to have a productive conversation at all. Everyone was like, "Oh, don't talk with Vosh. He's going to misrepresent you." And I was like, "Oh, I know. I'm just going to laugh about how this person thinks that every Black leftist he's debated is a Nazi, because I think that's funny, because literally, like, we can't all be Nazis." But then, I just also was painted as another Black leftist who's basically Hitler. So I think
Yeah.
that's what happened.
Yeah. By the way, before I just blindside you with this, some people in the chat want to ask questions. I'll vet them, of course. But are you comfortable with asking questions at some point in the conversation?
I think so. I think my main thing is I just don't want to debate or argue about um colonialism, because I think that's it's not something that I wanted to debate Vosh on, and it's
Mhm.
not something. There's a Dr. Heems conversation. I didn't want to argue with someone. I don't think that these things are something that it's appropriate to argue. I think the appropriate response is to actually listen to people who are colonized and seek understanding rather than arguing in hypotheticals. So I am willing to, answer questions, but I just do not want to argue the validity of indigenous people.
It's also, and I think uh, there's something about what you were saying with respect to the way in which these things are sort of collapsed together. That's a radically different topic than what you were talking about in the early stages of your conversation with Vosh. And it's a topic that requires a lot of historical expertise that far outstrips my ability. Um,
I mean,
and
same here. Like I am not prepared to have a lot of these conversations. I don't feel comfortable debating them. And I feel very frustrated that I ended up debating it in front of hundreds of thousands of people who now uh don't understand these issues probably even less than when they came in, because they were all represented through dystopian genocides and through hypotheticals that are not in the realm of what's happening.
yeah, and I mean, like, we can take those seriously. Like, we can have a conversation about, like, okay, well, if we really like get into the weeds about this practically, is there actually a way to avoid? And I mean, my position, of course, is that practically there isn't, because all politics is violence. The word politics comes from a piece of military technology. It refers to a fortress, but like, we can get into the weeds about whether or not it's practically possible to establish even a justly motivated ethno state or something like that, if we can assume that one were to exist. We can get into the weeds about whether that's possible, but um, that's a practical question, and that's that's a question for people who are concerned with, like, how to actually order society, not with necessarily critiquing attitudes within society as it is now. That's an entirely different domain, and the stakes are really high. So to just kind of waffle between, we're talking about how Vosh regards black nationalists in the context of a community existing now, versus, well, if we give them any amount of charity and then we let their ideas just run through to their end conclusion, what will happen? Like, these are radically different things, and you should be able to treat both separately. Um,
Um, I also want to make a clarifying point
Please.
too. Not all Black nationalists are Black separatists, but all Black separatists are Black nationalists. Just in case anyone isn't sure, because Black nationalism itself is about self-determination for Black people. It's about like loving your Blackness. So the movements can go hand in hand, but they're
Mhm.
not necessarily the same. Black separatism is specifically about like Black people creating as much distance from white supremacy as possible, and then also Black people having their own governance. So they both tie in with self-determination, but they're not necessarily the same thing.
Right, and nationhood understood here, obviously, like, there's and this is where it gets a bit sketchy again, because we tend to think of white and black as ethnic differences, but they're really not. And you bring this forward when you bring this to the fore when you mention the ethnic diversity of Africa. Um, that's a colonial bifurcation that doesn't actually observe actual ethnic differences. So when we're talking about black nationalism, we're talking about not really nation in the sense of, and of course there are people who do this nonetheless, but we're not necessarily talking about nationalism in the context of racial prioritization. We're talking about nationalism in the context of community specifically. Does that,
Mhm.
am I following?
Yeah, and just to, like, a quick recap, in my video, I talk about how like the nations, especially like in America, were formed. So like there's an indigenous nation, and there was a point where there was like all these different indigenous people, and they all had their, and they still have their individual identities, tribes, territories, ways of living. But then when colonialism happened and they were all forced into these boarding schools where literally they were if they talked in their native tongue, they were beaten,
Yeah.
and they were like forced to speaking English. they were forced to assimilate to society, or to specifically white society. And there was this very pivotal moment where indigenous people in the US were like, we're actually a group of people, even though we still have our individual identities. We're a group of people, and we're a group of people standing against colonialism, essentially,
And against
and
genocide.
and against genocide.
Yeah.
And so that is an indigenous nation within the US. And for Black people, similar story. Slavery happened, people were speaking different languages. People kind of just like assumed that everyone was just like this singular group. Not at all. There's people from all over, and they were speaking different languages, had different heritages, backgrounds. And then at some point, people were like, well, we're Black. We're not just like, and it's really tragic, because for Black Americans, we don't even remember exactly where we come from. That identity was lost. And so there was a point where we're like, well, we're Black Americans, and that is a nation. And I think people have a hard time understanding that, because they think of nationalism in terms of white nationalism. And it's like, there's white nationalism, that's an issue. But, nationalism isn't just white nationalism. When you look up nationalism, actually, there's a very rich history, globally, of oppressed nations coming together under their oppression and standing against their oppressors. And that's what the Black nation is. That's what the indigenous nation is in the US.
That's what the French nation is. It was an assertion of the rights of the citizen as equivalent with the denizen of France, over and above the rule of the state. Of course, King Louis declared before that as an attempt to assert himself as being equivalent with the community as a whole, so he couldn't be budged. I am the state, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, like, there's unfortunately, like, a lot of that history is related to where I'm sitting right now, but there's the concept of the nation has been heavily perverted such that it becomes equivalent with the state, and then we start thinking of nationhood as inherently violent in a similar fashion. But as you say, again, like, we simply aren't talking about the same thing. I noticed a comment here that I just want to address really quickly. Where is it? Here we are. Here we go. President Sunday has been spoon feeding a lot of these reasonable positions and asking, do you agree with this? Well, yeah, because I think that there was an error in communication. So I'm offering a translation of those points and seeing if they're representative. I don't see what's wrong with that. Anyways, we'll keep going. But a nation is not a state. Yeah, exactly. So that's out of the way. I didn't want to just talk to you about that. It's again really frustrating to me, given what I've seen of your material, that this is all people want to talk to you about, especially given, again, I don't think a tremendous amount of your material is specifically on prospective political solutions to colonialism. It's about addressing and understanding colonialism and things like that, or understanding racism, or what have you. And I suppose one question that I'm really interested in hearing an answer from you on is, what to your mind are the major barriers towards people, like, what are the sticking points where people fail to sort of understand this discourse, this specific understanding of race and racism, and even the language of understanding too? It's taken as kind of appeasement towards people who are then construed as equivalent to Nazis for the reasons we just discussed. What in your experience are the issues where people really sort of fail to understand where you're coming from?
Well, I think in the Vosh debate is a whole other beast. And I kind of like talked about that already. But I think in general, I think people have a hard time. There's just like a number of reasons why I think people have a hard time. I think, for example, leftists tend to think that, well, I'm leftist now, so I kind of have the right ideas about things. And there is this really bizarre, or not bizarre, but people don't seem interested in talking about racism or colonialism. And so I think there's just like a simple just lack of exposure to these conversations. And then people think that, well, I'm leftist, so like I already have the right ideas. There's like this resistance to it that's kind of frustrating because you would think like, oh, I'm a leftist, so like I should learn more about these things. But I think there's just like a simple lack of exposure to talking about racism. Like critical race theory was banned in Florida. And when you ask people, well, what is it? The people who banned it couldn't even give you an answer. So yeah, I just think really lack of exposure. I think lack of spending time with non-white people, because I think a lot of these things you don't even really have to study, although I think that's certainly helpful, but just talking to non-white people, I think you tend to start to get an understanding of things. Watching media that's made for non-white people, like again, something that's even like fun to do, watching media, people are just not interested. So I think there's this way where like even in leftism, racism is being talked about, but it's being talked about specifically through white people who also don't really know Black people, aren't really watching Black media, and also aren't really reading books on critical race theory, things like that. And so you get a very shallow analysis a lot of times, and that's as far as it goes, even in leftism.
And I noticed there is, and this is kind of strange because Vosh doesn't bill himself as a liberal, and most people wouldn't describe him as a liberal in a general sense. Sorry about the beeping, by the way. My dryer sensor is dying, so it thinks that it's on fire constantly, and that's why it's going off all the time. I'm probably going to set it on fire if that continues much longer as it is. But there's a lovely Irish Republican lefty content creator called Zanzi who made a really good and really nerdy video on Final Fantasy VII and ideology. But he goes over a distinction between different concepts of ideology that I think is somewhat useful here. There's the liberal conception of ideology, which insists that ideology is a set of ideas and projects that you take on. You think of it almost like in a similar way as we talk about a person's religion sometimes. Oh my God, dryer, shut up. And it seems to me like, for example, when people characterize Vosh as white supremacist, they're not saying that he's taking on like a Nick Fuentes project. I think it actually goes back to, again, the sort of falling back on colonial institutions and things like that. And again, like distinguishing whiteness from white skin per se, because of course nobody's skin is white unless they're very unhealthy. What it ends up being is sort of a de facto assertion. Give it a sec, it'll stop. Okay. A de facto assertion of these colonial institutions as simply being either the neutral starting point that you have done no harm by leaving untouched, or as in fact a good that must be protected at all costs. Whereas when you're talking about, and so like in that respect, it makes these quote unquote white institutions quite supreme in practice, because you treated them as the essentially human things that, again, all other things must fall for the sake of. And it strikes me that that's sort of that liberal undercurrent. And I'm not like using that in a disparaging way per se, but we need to sort of understand what we're doing when we do this. That liberal undercurrent strikes me as being the major thing that prevents people in your position from having that kind of positive communication with, because any kind of actual institutional intervention is treated on the one hand for what it is, which is radical and involving inherently violence in the sense of you are violating this constructed sphere that these institutions sort of sustain. But they also characterize it as sort of ideologically equivalent with every other group that wants to do the same thing. And of course, these are all collapsed into the very worst. So of course we think of like Nazis and whatnot. We want to break down all the liberal institutions and restructure really all the same liberal institutions, but with a very powerful race bias, things like that. That strikes me as the major sticking point that makes communication practically impossible, because it switches your interlocutor, like Vosh, especially when they're bigger than you, from a mode of I want to understand you to a mode of I have an obligation, both moral and in front of my audience for the sake of my reputation, to beat you in real time while we're talking. What do you think? I talked for a while. It's okay if you.
No, it's fine. I just get stuck on the Vosh like being like like his moral obligation to like beat you in front of an audience. I really do think that comes down to just digging his heels in more so than what you're talking about. Like the like I think people don't understand. like I think in the Dr. Heemed thing, I was like talking about Vosh as being a white supremacist. And I think there's people who are like explicitly like, I'm a white supremacist. I'm a card holding member of the KKK. But I mean white supremacist in a way where our society white is a white supremacist society. It's not really a hard thing to do. And maybe I'll just say the word racist even just because it sounds less harsh. But I think there's this way where people kind of have this like neutrality where it's like, well, I'm starting off from this very neutral point, and it's like actually the point that you're starting off is coming from a racist society. And so everyone in society has an issue on race, and it's not about you being a good or bad person. It's just the situation that we're in. And if people could get that, then we could talk about racism without people feeling really threatened. Because I also think an aspect of whiteness, um, everyone wants to be a good person. Everyone wants to feel like they're a good person and like they're doing good. And I think that's very human. But I think there's something specific that's being threatened. Um, there's something very specific about whiteness that is being threatened when at the mere suggestion that you could be doing something that's bad. This just makes white people just explode at the notion. That's why there's like the whole joke about Karens and things like that, where it's like suddenly some very core part of your identity is being threatened, and it's a possibility that you might be doing something that's messed up, and that just causes people to explode. But I think with Vosh specifically, I really do think that's just I think it's that, but I think it's also just him digging in his heels in a way where it's just I don't really think he had to do that. I think he could have just been like, yeah, I had this debate on black nationalism, misrepresented it to thousands of people, apologize about it, and then maybe like make a video saying what it actually is or something like that. And he sort of just kind of continued to dig his heels to the point where I'm debating him, and I'm sure to the point that will happen even afterwards. I'm sure more will come from this with other people.
It's difficult to say you're wrong near the end because again, like there was a point where there was some clarity and you had sort of started to have a more amicable back and forth. And he still just went right back down to that. And I don't know how much of that I can attribute to sort of like a deliberate choice on his part and how much of that is just personal weakness. I flat out don't know. But it was absolutely frustrating to see. Someone asked for clarification on racism and white supremacy in this context. It's actually kind of trivial, and please correct me if I'm mistaken on my read on this. It actually seems fairly trivial if you characterize sort of institutional racism as being the bias against people on racial lines at the level of sort of institutional processes. It's trivial then to say that also biases in favor of the people who are not subject to bias by that system. So that strikes me as how institutions, without of course having like a conscious person with a racist idea in their head, that's how that becomes white supremacist in fact.
Yeah, and I think white supremacy is very much just like how do I get it? Like so I don't know if I'm over explaining when I say this, but literally the category of like the white racial group didn't used to exist. And then it existed when white settlers colonized the US. They created this like white racial category. And then there was like the indigenous peoples. And then there was also black slaves shortly after. And so it basically, there was like essentially a caste system that was created. And it was like, well, we're white, you're not white, we have therefore you're less human and we have the right to subjugate you. And so white supremacy is kind of just like this continuation of this mentality. In short, it's this continuation of like, well, white is right, and that might not be explicitly said, but that's something that we experience in society to this day. And so you kind of see like everywhere this idea that like, well, being an American, for example, is considered being white, and for everyone else, they're kind of otherized. There's constantly the otherized of non-white people. Even the fact that we still categorize ourselves in this way is white supremacy. And so, from white supremacy, you're going to get racism out of that, systemic racism specifically towards non-white people. And so, at the end of the day, it's kind of splitting hairs, but sometimes I'm not sure what to say, because no matter what word you use, it's going to be really upsetting to white people. You could say like, oh, well, you're a white supremacist, not explicitly, but just in the fact that you're benefiting off of white supremacy and you're not really doing much to go against it. And then that upsets white people. Or you could say, well, okay, you're racist, even if you're not like intending to be, you're still, having racist behaviors and words because you come from a racist society. And even if it's not about you being a good or bad person, it's just a matter of fact that's what we're dealing with. And that's also going to upset white people. So sometimes I just struggle with, how can I describe this without upsetting white people? And at the end of the day, there's not really a way for me to be able to talk about racism without that being really upsetting.
Hold that thought. I'm just going to try and close the door and see if I can't block out that infernal beeping. Just me one moment.
Sure. While President Sunday is doing that, I'm just going to rant a little bit to everyone here. Like that person who was like, President Sunday is just spoon feeding you answers. It's like, literally, we had talked about, I like had talked to President Sunday being like, hey, are you a debate bro or something? And then we cleared that up. So like President Sunday and I have talked about this stuff before. And so I think that's also why they're asking me these questions, because we've had a previous conversation. But then also it's really frustrating because it's like literally in the minds of thousands of people, I'm literally just like a genocidal Black separatist. And it's like, I'm just gonna have to live with that now. Like to so many people, I even read the comments in like the Dr. Heemed thing the President Sunday had, and it was just like, yeah, I don't want to talk with someone, I don't want to argue with someone about Indigenous people because it's not a hypothetical. And if I'd known that that's what it was, I wouldn't have like gone on there and talked with him. And it's just like in the mind of all these people, I'm just like a really cranky, crabby, genocidal Black separatist, and that's just gonna be my life now.
I mean, there's a
Anyways,
market
that's
for
my
that.
rant. Say that again.
I said there's a big market for that.
Apparently.
Yeah. I didn't like the Dr. Heem thing. Somebody said that it's not his style to ask leading questions, but when I was watching that, it seemed very strongly to me, especially we didn't get through the whole thing because again, like OBS hates me or YouTube hates
Me
me.
too. Oh my gosh, it's like the bane of my existence.
I noticed it's like you're on a hook and they're just lowering you into the water every few minutes.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, your audio's been pretty stable right now, so you're.
Oh, I'm not using. That's because I'm not using OBS.
Oh, there you go. Well, I'm not either today. Usually OBS is great. It's just sometimes it just doesn't work.
Issues with it. It's probably me though too. So.
Yeah, I think it's just Shaw sucks, but yeah, the Heemed one, it seemed very strongly to me like he was fishing for, here's this person who's controversial for genocide abetting or something on Vosh. Let me get some of that. That's how I read the interaction. It was annoying to see. Yeah, go on.
Oh, I didn't mean to cut you off. Sorry.
No, please.
I think this person, the thing is that frustrates me, like I think this person was like being sincere, where it's like, I want to understand you, but also I'm going to push back. But I think this thing happens where people don't realize that there are certain things that you should not do that for. Like on the topic of colonialism, for example, I think, like I said, when I was talking with Dr. Heemed, I was like, our opinions are only as relevant as they represent colonized people. I think that's like generally true. And it's like, these things aren't, these topics. So Dr. Heemed came in and was like, I don't really know anything about this. Mm-hmm. And to me, like that should have just been my first red flag of me not wanting to talk with this person, because this is something that you should really understand first. Like your understanding should be built around listening to colonized people before talking about it. And it's not something that
it's a brutally difficult topic to talk about, even if you know what you're saying. Like it's dangerous. Yeah.
And it's not something that, especially like I think as a leftist, like I don't think it's something that should be debated in a public space. I know like Dr. Heem says, like I kind of have conversations and push back, but even arguing about it, if your goal isn't to represent colonized people, I think there's so much damage that can be done. And luckily he doesn't have like a super large platform like Bosch, But even in the debate with Vosh, like my biggest regret was that there are literally hundreds of thousands of people who believe that we should have a fear of retribution when that's not even what Indigenous people are talking about. It's like, it's such a sensitive topic. And that's why I just was like, I don't know if you ever finished the video with Dr. Heen, but I was like, I can't talk about this. I don't want to talk about, I don't want to argue the validity of Indigenous people. And our conversation actually ended with him trying to say that like light-skinned people are the equivalent to, or light-skinned Black people are the equivalent to white people. And I was like, they're not. And I don't want to argue the validity of this. I'm down to have a conversation about it, but I don't want to have an argument about it. And so I like thanked him and then left. But I think the frustrating thing is like, I think because he's never looked into colonialism more, then to him, he's like, well, I'm just asking these innocent questions. And these like hypothetical extremes are actually painting a distrust of colonized people. And people naively don't understand that that's exactly what's happening. And it's really frustrating because the catch-22 is if you study colonialism more, then you see the damage that's being done. And if you haven't studied it, then you're like, well, I'm just asking these innocent questions that actually are not so innocent.
Yeah, and it struck me as peculiar that on the one hand he was knowledgeable enough to know that Indigenous Americans and Indigenous Canadians, or what have you, they are, insofar as we're talking about specifically isolated Indigenous communities, these are often communities that are highly deprived and typically like lacking clean water and basic things like that. So even in the context of like, as they wouldn't characterize themselves this way, at least nationalists certainly wouldn't, but as subjects of the state, they're being abused. What struck me as strange is that he can flip from this to people who are basically just advocating for honoring treaties that were made with their communities that have been not. And anti-colonialism as being the violent appropriation of the state apparatus by the indigenous bands, which nobody argues for because they would have no capacity to do so and no benefit from trying. So it's like, it's weird. I don't think I have ever seen an indigenous nationalist who wasn't a kid, frankly, characterize their project as, we want to take over the government and kick out the white people.
Yeah, and that's what really, so this person is able to say that because they watched a Vosh debate, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah.
That's as far as their understanding and interest
Before
in the topic.
Sorry to cut you off. Before we get into it, we already agreed that we weren't going to talk about that particular topic. Are you cool with talking about the Dr. Heem thing a little more, or do you want to move on?
I can talk about it. Yeah, I'm like kind of angry about it because I did not realize that that's what it was going to be. Otherwise, I just wouldn't have wasted either of our times. So, and then I also saw that you like had a video on it, and then people were saying like, oh, this person's in really bad faith or da 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 da. And it's like, well, I wouldn't have wasted my time talking to this person if I knew it was going to be me trying to convince him that we should give Indigenous people their land back.
Yeah, which is respectable because like it's one of those things. Like debates are good in one of two cases. One where you have like good moderation and both people are serious and you can actually, it devolves into like a productive conversation sort of, and you actually get understanding from it. The other is if you know the other person is wrong and you know for a certainty that you'll destroy them in public. And when it's like a random encounter like this, neither of those are the case. So the only thing that can possibly happen is drama colors over a very difficult conversation that should be treated with nuance and care. And people leave thinking that, in addition, Indigenous nationalists are also crazy because of this, which is like, I think that was actually responsible to excuse yourself from that conversation. I think what was really frustrating to me about it is that he was playing a really slippery game with you. He was characterizing himself as a non-white immigrant in order to show that by affirming Indigenous rights to traditional territory and treated territory, excuse me, this was therefore an example of just the way in which, uh, you know, nationalists of any sort will always just eat their own or something like that. Like it struck me as very slimy. And the analogy that I made in the context of that conversation was like, my watching it, I should say, was that it's sort of like, because he said something to the effect of like, well, why can't this just be our place too? Like we're all just immigrants here, and nobody's actually held onto a piece of territory forever. So therefore, like the indigenous nationalist project is sort of moot or corrupt or something. And the analogy I made was like, well, it's sort of like if somebody breaks down your door and then pushes you and your family into a back corner of the house and then starts inviting all of their friends over, and then tells you when you start banging on the door saying, hey, let us out of the room and give us back our house. The friends are like, well, hang on, we've been here for a few hours. Like, why do you have any more right to the rest of this house than we do? And the claims are very modest. It's like, okay, fine, look, you came here, you broke down our door. We'll make an agreement with you. Give us this room with running water. And then you're like, no. So I don't know. It strikes me as just really presumptuous that you would think that because you feel comfortable with the state of affairs. And I think this really brings up again when you were talking about it's important to be conferring with the people who are actually directly affected by these things. Because if there's a structural part of an argument that invokes how somebody feels, if you're making that part up, which is effectively what you're doing, if you haven't actually talked to people who are experiencing that, then your argument effectively rests on a fiction. I'm rambling, but you sort of get my issue with that, because I think it was very similar to yours. It was like facts don't care about your feelings. I don't know what to say.
Yeah. I think to me it's the conversation felt really gross, but I think that they were being sincere on some level. I think there really is an issue with not because this person said that they didn't know anything about colonialism, implying that this is not something they had really talked about. And I was really lucky to I took an Indigenous studies class in college, and so and I took it because I was like, oh, I need to take fulfill this requirement. Oh, Indigenous studies, that sounds cool. And I was very lucky to have an incredible professor who really, I think everyone there, it didn't matter like what race, but we really understood the atrocities of colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
In reference to Indigenous people, because Black people are also a colonized people. But for me, I think I was like really lucky to be like, this is an atrocity, and giving Indigenous people their land back is the least that we could do, is the least. And so I think a lot of people have not had these conversations at all. And so this is new. The fact that there are Indigenous people asking for their land back, this is new information. And so I think that conversation felt really gross to me, but I think they were also just an example of someone who hasn't really explored these things before until there was a Vosh debate
and yet
retribution.
And yet had those answers ready. So that's a little interesting.
Well, I think it's people have these answers ready because like I'm trying to think like before I, was like cared about these things. I'm sure there's just some sort of like give people their land back, but like we're here, so we just can't. There's this kind of like there's just like this kind of like, well, I've never thought about this before. And I think into our society, because we live in a white supremacist society, there's this kind of like built-in like there's this built-in fear of retribution already. Like this person, Dr. Heem, seemed really focused on like, well, why are we? He seemed very focused on protecting the feelings of white people rather than listening to colonized people. And I think that's like very built into. I think that's like almost a knee-jerk reaction. And so like the not knee-jerk reaction is being like, well, what are colonized people actually saying? Like, let's take some time to actually listen to this instead of, I think the initial reaction is this kind of, it would be his response actually, because of how our society is, if that makes sense.
And on that point, because I'm seeing a lot of questions relating to this in the chat. So when we're talking about land back in the context of indigenous nationalism, I think it's crucial to understand, and this is actually a point, unfortunately, that a lot of white nationalists bring up as an apologia for the Canadian state. Indigenous land ownership was, on the first hand, not identical to the European concept of the identity between, like the law of the sea and like state boundaries and things like that. And additionally, the indigenous bands treated land. So there is land, according to those treaties, that the crown has a right to, and there are lands that the indigenous people has a right to. The issue is that that other end of the bargain wasn't upheld, and we're constantly ravaging that territory. Again, like there is at no point in any of the discourse around indigenous land back or anything like that is the vacating of cities of white people ever tabled. That's not a thing. There would be no reason to do so. It would neuter the state of all whatever benefit could be gained by obtaining it in the first place, because we're talking about a relatively very small population of people, not negligible but small, certainly smaller than could be construed in any sense as representing some kind of existential threat to any other group in Canada or in the States for that matter. So when we're talking about like giving the land back, we're not talking about kicking you out of your house and giving an indigenous family your house. We're talking about not letting companies pollute and destroy the environment around territories that they are supposed to own by right, by the word of our state. So
yeah, and I also want to clarify at least my position on this. Like indigenous, there's the treaties that the U.S. has with indigenous people that they've broken, and in Canada as well. But at the end of the day, even regardless of those treaties, this land is the land of indigenous people's land, and I think people need to understand that they should maybe feel thankful that indigenous people aren't asking for all their land out and aren't seeking to kick out everyone living in the U.S.
Or,
I think people
treat it
should
with a
feel. I think
modicum of respect and not turning it into a howling desert of highways and suburbs.
Yeah, I think people should feel thankful instead of fearful that, indigenous people are just asking for, federal land that's not being used as part of it, and then also the treaties that were broken. And
Mhm.
and just the fact that it makes people, fearful just in that makes me so angry, because I think they would have every right to say we want all of our land back, and they're not even doing that. They're just asking for federal land that's not being used, and they're asking for the treaties that have been broken, and certain monuments. And yeah, people need to understand that's what's going on.
I like that you bring that up, because one thing that's been pretty terrible in my city is that there was a really expensive resort development nearby, and I've unfortunately been working near it recently. But in order to set it up, there was effectively a cemetery. Well, we would consider as a cemetery, with a series of caves that were used as a burial site for I don't know which band it was exactly, but it was a traditional burial site. There were like human remains and whatnot in there. And in order to clear the land for this resort, they literally did what they did in the Amityville Horror, and they blasted the tombs effectively in order to build a hotel over top of it. And the argument is that this doesn't qualify as a religious site because there are no buildings on top of it. And it's sort of like, imagine if some culture that built, like a specific pyramid structure or something over their religious sites went to went to France or England or whatever, and then just started blasting churches on the grounds that these lacked these specific buildings to signify that they merited some kind of protection. Like, to the extent that we're talking about sites that do actually exist in like urban dwellings, we're generally talking about like just show basic respect for really very small sacred spaces that have significant cultural and emotional significance to these people. And it strikes me as baffling again that this would be construed as, in some sense, unjust or tyrannical on the part of those bands for wanting to protect those. Like, it's such a modest claim, really.
Yeah, I completely agree.
But winding back a little bit, there was one thing I wanted to pick your brain on, and I don't know how long you want to go for because I don't want to exhaust you.
I'm totally fine. I'm having fun. I
Oh,
feel
good.
like I'm venting a lot of my frustration about this. I am making a video about it, so like that'll be like some venting, but I'm having some fun just venting about this.
Brilliant. Okay, well, hopefully this doesn't frustrate you too much then. So when we're talking about like not upsetting white people with these terms, so one of the issues that happens when discussing like black nationalism in the context of like the Vosh debate, say, or just in any context really, there is a tendency to attach all of this baggage to different kinds of nationalism or um, even like in a bare sense conjectures about like the practicality of having a black only space in any context. We attach all of this baggage almost reflexively of like segregation or even of like the Holocaust um, to these things. So we talk about nationalism. Well, you know, that's like Nazism was a form of nationalism, so it's, you know, it's all sort of the same thing. And we need to be more careful about that. On the flip side, I think what freaks a lot of people out is that when we refer to individuals as racist or white supremacists, we attach that same baggage to that. And so, what I wonder is because these terms are so technically embedded in our language about this stuff, and we want to be able to parse it out more specifically. Um, what are your thoughts on how we do that? Because when we characterize someone, like let's say Vosh, for example, when we characterize Vosh as white supremacist, say, we mean so in a sense. We don't mean he's Nick Fuentes. We don't mean he wants to start a whites only canton in the middle of Alabama or somewhere. We mean he advocates for things construed in such a way that they tend to the supremacy of institutions or of processes or of tendencies or whatever construed as white in some sense. How do we avoid that while still without like completely alienating our terminology here? Like even when we're talking about like characterizing people as racist, we can fold these two meanings together, whether we're talking about like contributing to institutional processes or having like interpersonal bigotry. And we can say that, well, you have one because of the other and vice versa. But we also don't always necessarily want to imply both when we're saying that. So what are your thoughts on how to address that?
I think one thing that might help people is that you can talk about systemic racism and how, you know, we are all we come from a racist society. So this is an issue that we all are dealing with, and I'll say like it's not about being a good or bad person, and that sometimes helps, but I also feel frustrated that I have to say that because it ends up centering the feelings of white people as opposed to being able to actually talk about racism.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if black people kind of have the maybe patience to do that, I think that's something that can be helpful. But I think what would be also helpful for white people to understand, especially leftists, but I suppose white people in general, I think a lot of white people think that like Nazism is like the ultimate evil of black people and of racism. And you know, there's a way where it is, and then there's a way where I think a lot of black people um are actually more frustrated by the everyday racism that white people act out and
Just for
unknowingly.
clarification, do you mean that Nazism represents sort of the extreme to which their positions would be taken if they were sort of allowed to proceed unfettered, kind of thing? You're not saying that that's like just because I know you're being picked apart for stuff like this, you're not making an apology for Nazism.
No,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Let me clarify on that. I think so. What I'm talking about is how like people on the left will be like, you know, Ben Shapiro's. When they focus on racism, they're focusing on Ben Shapiro and they're focusing on Nazis, and it's like, yeah, like that obviously is an issue. But the thing that really upsets a lot of black people, you know, that stuff's upsetting, but you know, it's upsetting to hear someone be like, oh, like black people just needed to work harder this whole time and da 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 da. And you're like, there's racism. There's been years of racism that prevented black people from having resources. That's really frustrating. But then there's just the everyday racism that white people, you know, casually have that is extremely frustrating. I think I brought this up in my video where Kat Black talks about how she'd rather talk with Candace Owens than your average white person about Nazism. And then Bosch was like, oh, well, that means that she's a Nazi sympathizer. And I've heard her talk about this, so I know what she's talking about. She's saying that when you talk with someone who's a Nazi, you know what you're getting into. And so there's not like this like tragic surprise when you hear them say something racist. And I would even like to add that when I'm arguing with a Nazi, I can actually argue with them. I can be like, black people aren't less intelligent because they're making these claims. But when I'm talking with your average white person about racism, white people will be like, oh, like, I'm not racist. I just think that people should have been killed. Those black people deserve to be killed by the police. Like they weren't listening. And because they're saying that they're not racist, you can't really like it's a lot harder to argue with them because there's this denial of this actual racist reality that's happening. And I think a lot of white leftists would be like, well, that's racist. That's very obviously racist. But I think there's a lot of ways that white leftists are racist that black people spot immediately that white leftists are completely unaware of. And that's something that I think white leftists need to be aware of, that just because you're a leftist doesn't mean that you've gotten rid of racist tendencies. And it also doesn't mean that you're a bad person either. It's just the reality of coming from a racist society. And so I think it's good to be aware of that. And that might make the conversations about racism go a little bit easier if you can understand that there's all these blind spots that you probably have. Then it won't be so, alarming when someone brings up these blind spots.
Yeah, and I think I guess if somebody's willing to out themselves as a Nazi overtly, you can at the very least say that they're not, holding their cards back.
Mhm.
I used to engage in a sort of a critique along these lines as well. Like there is a practical sort of political angle in which you're like, well, don't use that lingo, yada yada, because it's like it's creating all this animosity and things like that. But at the same time, I mean, there's 2 points there. First, like there's the obvious cynical point that the obnoxiousness of the rhetoric to certain people itself is a signal booster, so there's political reason to keep on engaging in it. But secondly, I mean, yeah, it's like, okay, sure, we can see how in a perfect world, if everybody's a little Machiavellian genius, we can sort of all, what's the word I'm looking for? We can sort of all curate our language so that it has maximal political effect in all times. But at the same time, a lot of these, besides the fact that that's hardly a certainty of succeeding, we're talking about people who are speaking in a certain way and engaging in certain ways as a result of things done to them. So as somebody who is not them, to start saying that, it just seems inappropriate. It's not like, and sometimes this is characterized as in some sense condescending, like you think they can't do better. Well, no, it's just like, it's not your place. It's sort of like when you see rhetoric about poor black people just need to work harder and be more frugal with their money or whatever. That may practically be true on an individual level. That is the way in which an individual will succeed. But that's something that's appropriate for like a parent to say to their child, not for you as a member of an out group to start declaring as an explanation for the status of another group. Like it's an appropriateness of who you are saying that thing is where I think that comes from.
And I also think a lot of people, times when people say like, oh, black people just need to work harder, like
Yeah.
they, in those instances, people don't know people from those communities. They have no idea. It's like black people are like some of the most hardest working people in America. It's like people will have like multiple jobs and they're still, really broke. It's like Vosh talks about like people shooting up people in the streets of Detroit. It's like, have you been to Detroit? Like you don't know what you're talking about. And you should at least know what you're talking about. I think to have authority on the topic, you at least have to know what you're talking about, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and at the same time, it's like, sure, everyone should work harder, duh. But like it's like, like if a rich person tells a poor person, you just need to not spend all of your money and work harder and just like suffer the inconveniences of life instead of trying to medicate them by buying things and whatnot, as people do when they characterize poor students, say, as being impoverished because they're spending money on avocado toast or something like that. It's like, yeah, maybe, but we're also like spending that money to deal with pains that you don't suffer from. So like you're it's probably like something there as a brute fact, but first of all, shut up. And secondly, that ends up being an apology for again further neglect of these communities. And I mean same thing back. Not to equate the two, but it's just like it's just kind of heartless and cruel. The only upshot of that again is an argument for neglect, and that's always how this is brought up. Um, but yeah, she literally just whitewashed Candace Owens' white supremacy. No, she did the opposite. She said that Candace
Oh
Owens'
my
white
gosh.
supremacy is covert.
Oh,
It makes it worse. She said she's worse than a Nazi.
I don't know. It's like every time I say something, I can't even say anything. I'm just, I don't know. I don't know. It's like no matter what I say, it's just not going to it's just going to be taken in a way that is just not at all what I said. And I feel like really on edge because even though I'm like saying that Nazism is really horrible, I'm talking about like what frustrates Black people on a day-to-day basis. And it just feels like it just does not matter. If I explain myself or what I have to say, like at the end of the day, I'm a Nazi.
Like,
I'm a Nazi sympathizer. I love genocide. I pulled a genocide the other day, and yeah, I'm a Black separatist who wants an ethno state. So sure, we'll just go with that. We're just gonna go with that.
no, I don't think so. I feel like there you could have, but I think you were blindsided. I think you entered into a conversation. I don't remember the exact terms of what the conversation was supposed to be framed as when you first went in. But you entered into a conversation with someone who is significantly larger than you, has a different skill set in terms of presentation, has a massively sympathetic audience, and has a massively sympathetic audience, full stop. We're talking about someone who's like, how big is he? Like 360,000 subscribers at the moment. We're talking about a difference of orders of magnitude. I think there was a way to do that, but not as that conversation was framed. It was framed antagonistically, and he had all the cards. It just wasn't a fair engagement. I feel like with like significant preparation and maybe moderation that could have worked, but not as such. That was a gong show. Well done surviving for 3 hours though. That by itself was impressive. I would have died by that point. But yeah. So what's in the future for you? What are you planning on doing with all of your ill-gotten clout?
I'm making a follow-up video that I hopefully will have out by next week. I know that it's kind of coming out late, but I research things for it because I prefer making video essays than just like debating. So often it takes me weeks to make a video. That's coming out. And then after that, I think for me, like that is really trying to put the Vosh stuff behind me. But
yeah,
there's just so many things to address out of that debate where it's like, there's just so many things to address. I think a lot of people are kind of speaking on my behalf for me in a way where I'm like, yes, that is what I intended to say. Thank you for saying that. But I just wanted to make an official video addressing some of these things. And then after that, I'm probably going to make my video on whiteness, but I also am not sure because a lot of people think that I'm genocidal. So I'm kind of just like,
I think you should finish that project, first of all, because your previous ones were very lucid and good. I thought they were actually very clarifying on all those points. And I think, again, like, I think you had a bad run of things because of how you were framed in that Vosh encounter, but I don't think it's going to age as badly as you think. I think your actual presentation is going to come out more as you grow and as you get better at this and as more people start paying attention to the nuances of what you were saying.
It's not even like...
Yeah?
Oh, I'm sorry. It's not even like, don't worry about it, like, aging badly. It's just like every time I say something, and I think this is going to be for the rest of my YouTube career, but every time I say something, people are like, you're genocidal. And I'm just like, I just don't even like know what to do. It's like, I think
there are exceptions.
And especially if I'm talking about racism. I mean, there's lots of people who are like defending me as well, which I really appreciate. And yeah, but it's just like, I just don't want, I don't know. I'm worried about making a video on critical race theory and then having Vosh fans see it and be like, this person is, unhinged or something. And somehow they're going to like think about genocide in there. Like, even in this conversation, I was like talking about how like, like the everyday racism is more frustrating than engaging with a Nazi on
Mhm.
most cases. And that's not just like me, that's like a lot of other Black people feel like that. And it's like, that was taken as me like excusing Nazism. It's like, I just kind of feel like every time I say something, I feel like I have to be, I just feel like really on edge. Like, even if I qualify what I'm saying, it's not enough. And I'm just kind of like, not really sure like what my next steps are. I probably will try to finish my whiteness video because I've been talking about it for so long, and I was actually like working on it before all this drama happened. But it's also just kind of like, I don't really want to engage with people who think I'm a genocidal Black separatist. Like, that's just like not the world that I live in. And it's just really bizarre. And yeah.
Well, I won't tell you to do something that you think is going to be uncomfortable for you, that you don't think is worth it. But from my perspective, at least, I think perception on these things tends to move slowly but fairly definitively. And maybe it'll be the case that when this comes out, a lot of people sort of in the Vosh orbit will think poorly of it, but I don't think that's going to be the case for very long. And I think by and large, as people start to pay attention to what's being said, I think you'll come through in a good light on that, and I think it'll be beneficial. But that's just me. My general perception is that your stuff is fairly lucid and clear, and is the kind of thing that we actually need a lot more of. So I'm of course going to be biased in favor of saying yes, you should absolutely finish and publish it, but that's you. So
Thanks. No, I appreciate that.
yeah, no worries. If you are okay with it, I just wanted to swing through and see if we didn't have any questions that weren't an absolute disaster from the audience. And I
Oh,
won't take too
awesome.
much of your time with that. Yeah, let's see. There's a whole lot of comments about my dryer. I am so sorry about that. I murdered it when I went off screen. I don't think much of this question, but it's the first one that comes up. What do you think of Michael Brooks, assuming you're familiar? I'm not. Philosophy of being compassionate towards people but harsh towards institutions.
I'm not super familiar with that, but I'm assuming that it's just like the idea that we need to tackle the systemic issues and not the people who like um, contribute to the system. And if that's what's being talked about, I think that's generally true. But I think also the issue with white people is that you'll say like, hey, I think my YouTube channel, for example, or even my family, just to get a little bit personal. It's like, I was adopted by a white family. I learned that racism ended with the civil rights movement, and I grew up around white people, um, white conservative Christians, and I experienced a lot of racism. And it was very confusing for me because I learned that racism ended. And so there was a point where I was like, yeah, racism is still here, but people just must not realize it. People probably just don't know. And so like in the kindest way possible, I would try to talk to my family and my friends and be like, hey, like this thing is really racist and it's really hurting me. And they did not care. And so I think there's a point where it's like, yes, like, I can see how white people are, we all just grew up in this society. We didn't get to choose that we were in this society. And so there's a way where white people are racist. They didn't really choose to be. But I think my issue is that often when you're like, okay, like you didn't really realize this, but let me talk to you about how messed up this is for me. And not just me, of course, other people. I grew up middle class and I don't want to represent the hardships of every single Black person. But when we try to talk to white people and be like, this has been atrocious for us, the callousness, the way that white people often lash out and go, the problem isn't me, it's you. That is when I have an issue with you specifically.
Hmm.
Because it's not just that like, well, we all like, naively participate in this situation. It's been made clear, and people just do not care. And that's when I have an issue with those people not caring.
Okay. And Yeah, and I guess that comes back down to, again, and this is where it gets really clandestine, sort of the assumption that the uh, the status quo from that vantage uh, is therefore just like the baseline, and everything else is just a you problem that you need to sort out, kind of thing. That's where that contempt comes from, which is like, again, it's like we tend to think of white supremacy in terms of like a literal boot being stamped down by someone with a flag and everything, but it could literally just be like just a sort of covert conservative attitude, which is what that is when you're treating that as natural. A covert conservative attitude to a state of affairs that affects that in a subtler way. Um, uh, Question for Professor Flowers. We've gone over this already, but if it's not too obnoxious, this has been asked. Why are the mentioned topics not proper for arguing over, even if they're hypothetical? I ask this because I think people don't want to reduce themselves to mere understanding. I don't know what that latter part means, but maybe try to give like in a clear way. I take him to be asking, why are these specific topics, colonialism or land back or whatnot, why are these not proper for arguing over specifically? Online, I take them to mean.
Sure. Yeah, I think I'm trying to figure out how to like say this in like a cogent way. When you're arguing about, okay, so like we've established like this is what land back is. For example, land back is giving unused federal land back to indigenous people. It's giving certain sites back, certain treaties that were broken. That's what that actually is. And it's in the context of this like hundreds of years of colonial atrocity that never stopped happening. We're just in the continuation of that timeline. So that's what the issue actually is. And then when you talk about it in hypotheticals, like in the example of the Vosh debate, even though it wasn't talking about indigenous people in America, we're talking about colonized people in Africa. But we're talking about like, well, what if there's a genocide? Even that, it's like, what colonized people are plotting to genocide you? None of them are. And so the reason why I think it's dangerous to talk about this in hypothetical is because in that debate, I think his audience generally knew very little about colonialism. They knew very little about what land back is, which we established this is what land back is. They didn't have that knowledge. And instead, because we talked about it in this hypothetical of, what if there's a genocide? People understand it only in that context of, oh, we need to be worried about a genocide.
Can
And
I
so
ask
it
for a
spread.
clarification quickly?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you make the point of distinguishing between the actions of a people versus the actions of a dictator. So here's the clarification that I want, because this, I think, is where this all came really to a head. When we're talking about the tendency of nationalist projects, let's say to establish an X space, even in a space where, perhaps especially in a space where X is sort of vastly the majority, we're not talking about what actions a state would take to affect that. We're talking about what actions a people would. And when we're talking about the actions of a state, it seems to me that that's where it starts to inevitably lead down, something adjacent to ethnic cleansing in the sense that we typically, the baggage we typically attach to that. When we're talking about the self-determination of a people, that's all ambiguous. Like we can imagine this being achieved in radically different ways, or it's being construed in radically different ways, such that nothing of the sort even takes place. When you're talking about, so like, how would you characterize that distinction? That's where my mind immediately goes. Is that you took some pains; they were buried in the conversation, but you took some pains to clarify that. Well, you think that there are potentially practical ways to affect a black only space of some kind as the consequence of anti-colonial action. You're not for sort of the state action of sending boots on the ground to take people out of their houses and send them across the sea, right?
No, I'm
Yeah.
not. I'm not for that. And I also think what people need to understand is that that's not what indigenous people are almost, I don't think anywhere are for either. And also, like, if indigenous people said like, you need to get out because you've colonized this place, I think they would have every right to do that. And I think that we should all be thankful that that's not something that they're doing. I think there's an issue. It's strange to me because it's like, if in this like hypothetical of like, if indigenous people wanted to like kick everyone out, then people are like really afraid of the indigenous people rather than being angry at a colonialist system that would even put indigenous people in a position where they are trying to get their land back in the first place. But again, that's not something that indigenous people are trying to do. And I really
Yeah.
think that we should be express gratitude towards them instead of a
Right.
fear.
Yeah, and crucially, I'm so sorry to like talk for you in this case. I just really want to bear this out. When not that I think I'm talking for you, but like like really force sort of clarity on these points.
Oh no, you're spoon feeding me all the talking points.
Yeah, I mean, Professor Flowers is actually a plant. It's all been me the entire time. Her entire debate with Vosh was a script that I sent her away a couple weeks ago. No, but like when we're talking about indigenous groups having the right, we're not saying that they should. That's not a positive statement. We're just saying that technically, according to, again, the agreements we made that led to us being here, technically, according to our law, they have the right. Like, we're not even invoking necessarily right in the absolute cosmic sense. We're just saying, like, literally, like, what's your argument against it? The community that established you there did the same thing first, and then made agreements that, again, like, stipulate right to certain territories, or you've made statements to yourself in your own law that say that these communities have a right to the territory that they initially occupied. So
Yeah, I think that's very much what I'm talking about. So I keep on trying to make the distinction of they would have the right to do that, and I don't think that that's what they're going to do. And I also do even the debate, I say like, I think that would be like a very um like a very like disastrous thing to happen to like relocate millions of people. And at the same time, people need to understand that these people have been colonized for hundreds of years, and the fact that they aren't looking to do something like that, we should look at them with a sense of like, I don't want to say nobility, but like, just I keep on saying gratitude, but I don't know if that's like the best way
yeah.
to understand that like these people would have every right to do
Oh,
something.
you gone quiet there for a second.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're back now.
Okay, sorry. Sometimes my mic is still iffy, but it's like, I think what I'm trying to say is people would have every right to do that, and they're not going to. So we should be happy about that. I don't think people understand like the gravity, kind of how you're giving the example of like, well, someone comes into your house, pushes you into one room, and people are just asking, to have like a small portion of their house back with water.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't think people understand the gravity of colonialism. And that's what makes me really frustrated.
And just for clarification there too, again, somebody brought up this point that is very well put. Yeah, anti-colonialism also involves an interrogation and a criticism of the state, because the state is itself a colonial imposition. So when we're talking about the house in this context, we're not doing the same thing as a white nationalist does when they say like, well, no, this territory is like, this is white civilization, this is our house. We're talking about literally treated land that they agreed as an entity with the state to have a right to, that was violated. So it's an ongoing wrong. We're not talking about people contesting over the same kinds of thing here. However, I see that my ping is going way down, and I'm anticipating a sudden break in my connectivity here. So I think we've been going for about an hour and a half. I think this is probably the safest place to end off. Did you want to just say anything before we conclude, or shout out your channel, of course?
Sure. Yeah. My channel is called Professor Flowers. If you think I'm genocidal, just please leave me alone. But if
She's
if
not
you like what
genocidal.
I'm saying, check me out.
Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for watching. And thank you again for coming on. It's been lovely to talk to you. You're welcome back anytime.
Thanks. It's been really good to be here.
Take care.
You too.